Let's talk about one of the favorite real-time labs of evolution, the Galapagos finches. Peter and Rosemary Grant have been studying these birds year after year since 1976, giving us an understanding that natural selection doesn't just happen way back when, but is unfolding right in front of our eyes. In 1977, one of the islands experienced a drought. And suddenly, finches that had wider beaks that were able to crack harder shells were surviving more readily than finches that have thinner beaks. And then the next generation, the average bill size turned out to be larger. And voila, you have evolution right in front of our eyes. And interestingly, later the conditions shifted, and then the smaller beak-sized birds had an advantage, and the population shifted back to them again. It's really cool how quickly these changes can happen, and we can respond to the environmental shifts that are taking place. See, we can see that right up here. The beak depth versus the beak depth, and here's the millimeters of them. And then you see here, that's the average during 1976. And then we have us the drought in 1977. And then the next generation here, the survivors 1978, you see how that number shifted over. If you compare it, it's gone from about 9.5 here to a little bit over 10. And the other interesting thing is you got to see, look at the total number. Gone from 751 straight down to 90. So the totality of the number also shrunk because of the drought. But the ones that had an easier time surviving and then gave offspring, gave rise to the next generation, those were the ones with the deeper beaks. So what's really cool is how quickly these changes can happen in a response to environmental shifts. It's basically nature's real-time drama proving to us that Darwin and Wallace were onto something big. Limited resources, variation in traits in the offspring, and inheritance from parents really provides us change over time. What I find really cool that over time does not need to mean centuries, that over time can really be quick in one generation, as the finches show when they adjust their seed-eating tools. It really reminds me how adaptable life is and how the traits, the variations that are more favorable to a given condition are sort of prevailing. It's very interesting stuff. So we need variation and adaptation. Natural selection can't work if everyone in the population is basically a clone of each other. Different traits amongst individuals. And crucially, those different traits have to be genetic. If someone's taller just because he's had extra nutritious meals growing up, but not really has different genes, that won't affect how the traits get passed on to the next generation. Genetic variations come from two places, mutations and sexual reproduction. A mutation is a tiny glitch in the blueprint, and that can create a whole new version of a gene. Maybe your bird has a different color or a slightly different beak. And sometimes those mutations make it harder. A bird, for example, can't crack a seed with a specifically shaped beak compared to another one. And sometimes, sometimes those mutations make it easier, so we can crack the seed easier. That helps. And thirdly, sometimes mutations don't do anything obvious at all, and they're neutral. Sexual reproduction also shuffles the genetic deck. Remember, during meiosis, genes get mixed up, so each offspring ends up with its own hand of cards, so to speak. And that's why siblings look so different, even though they have the same parents. Now, if a particular heritable trait helps an organism survive or reproduce better in its environment, we call that an adaptation. So as we can see here, variation in organisms comes from mutations and sexual reproduction. We call it an adaptation when a heritable trait helps an organism survive or reproduce better in its environment. Adaptation is nature's custom fit solution for current conditions. Over time, as environmental conditions shift and certain variations increase or decrease in the population, adaptations emerge or adjust. Keep in mind, what's good or bad trait wise can change on a dime if the environment changes. A big billed finch might be king of a seed buffet one year, but not so much the next year, depending on the conditions. Evolution is all about matching your skills to whatever modern nature's menu looks like at the time. Definitely something to keep in mind next time you marvel about how creatures adapt to their surroundings. Now let's picture a big family tree, except instead of cousins of uncles, we have us entire species that are branching off in different directions. That's essentially what happens with divergent evolution. Two species start from a common ancestor and then track down separate evolutionary paths. A great example is how flowering plants have the same basic blueprint for reproductive organs, but they can look wildly different, adapting to different pollinators and environments. So, in divergent evolution, two species with a common ancestor develop uniquely. And a good example are these flowering plants from a common ancestor. Notice that the dense blue blazing star and the purple coneflower look very, very different. And yet both share a similar basic morphology. On the flip side, sometimes you see species that aren't relating at all, but end up evolving similar traits because they face similar challenges. This is convergent evolution, and it's how bats and insects both evolve wings. Bats have these webby skin and bone structures, whereas insects basically turned part of their exoskeleton into wings. We call these wings analogous structures because they serve the same function, which is flight in this case. But they didn't come from the exact same evolutionary route. Now, contrast that with something like wings of a hummingbird versus wings of an ostrich. They're both birds, so they do share a common ancestor with wings. And so those are homologous structures. The wings look different, teeny and agile for the hummingbird, and huge but not so flyable for the ostrich. Those two different looking wings, though, sprouted from the same original wing blueprint. Over time, each lineage tweaked their design depending on their lifestyle. So, homologous structures are differently evolved structures with a common origin. So, whether we're talking about diverging from a common ancestor, like we see when flowers branch out their reproductive strategies, or we talk about converging upon a similar trait, like bat wings versus insect wings, in our example, evolution is all about how living things respond to challenges in their environment. It's a pretty cool puzzle, and one that reminds me of how nature never fails to find creative solutions to the same basic issues, like wanting to eat, escape predators, or pollinate. Definitely something to keep in mind. The next time you see a hummingbird zipping by, or get a glimpse of a bat fluttering at dusk. All right, let's talk a little bit about modern synthesis next. Let's set the scene. Darwin and Wallace had their brilliant aha moment about natural selection, but they were missing a major piece: genetics. Back then, people believed in blending inheritance, the idea that offspring were just an average of their parents, kind of like mixing two paint of colors. That theory didn't jibe too well with Darwin's notion of gradual change over time. In the meanwhile, though, Gregor Mendel, an Austrian monk tinkering away in his garden, had already figured out the basics of genetic inheritance by 1866, right after Darwin's On the Origin of Species was published. But unfortunately, the scientific community didn't connect the dots between Mendel's work and Darwin's ideas until the early 20th century. At first, when biologists realized that genes were particulate, which are individual units that didn't just blend together, it seemed to clash with the concept of gradual evolution, like how do these tiny genes lead to small, subtle changes? But as more and more evidence piled up, folks managed to unite the principle of inheritance with natural selection. And this fusion is what we call the modern synthesis, the grand unifying theory of how evolution and genetics fit together. By the 1940s, it was fleshed out and it still is our go-to framework today. Modern synthesis, the unifying theory of how evolution and genetics fit together. In a nutshell, the modern synthesis explains how things like natural selection and other evolutionary pressures can shuffle a population's genetic makeup. Over generations, these little shifts add up, and we call those microevolutions. And then eventually they can spark a whole brand new species or big diversions, and that's what we call a macroevolution. So next time you hear about a slow genetic drift in a beetle population or a brand new species emerging on some remote island, just think that's the modern synthesis at work, bridging Mendel's peas and Darwin's finches into one tidy package of evolutionary magic. So microevolutions are small genetic changes within a population. And macroevolutions are large-scale changes that occur over a long period of time and can result in a new species. All right, let's go next to population genetics.